hanged by the corrupt judge at sunrise. A Lakota chief cut the rope and gave her a new dawn. You want to know about the rope? I've seen you looking at it. It hangs there on the post by the door. Old rope, gray now, stiff as a man who died of cold. And I've caught you touching it twice. The way a boy touches a thing he doesn't understand but knows matters. Your mother told you not to ask. She knows what it is, and she told you to leave it alone. And you've been leaving it alone for 4 years now, since you were tall enough to reach it. You're leaving in the morning. So tonight I'll tell you. Sit down. Not there, over here, closer to the fire. The cold gets in early this year. I can feel it in my right hand, the one the bullet broke, way up in the joint near the wrist. That hand tells me things now. Weather, change, the approach of something I can't name yet. It told me something the morning I rode into Harlan. Didn't listen. I was 38 years old, and I thought I knew what my hands could do better than what they felt. The town of Harlan, Montana Territory, autumn of 1887. You won't find it on a map now. It's under a reservoir, drowned in 1921 when they dammed the river, and I'm told not even the steeple shows above the water anymore. Good. Let it stay under. I'd been riding south for 6 days by then, coming down from the Standing Rock Agency where I'd spent 3 months trying to talk the Hunkapapa elder into a meeting with the commissioner. A meeting that went nowhere, the way those meetings always went. They wanted land. The commissioner wanted signatures. I wanted to sleep in my own bed. I've been working as, what the government called, an interpreter, and what the Lakota called something closer to the man who speaks in the enemy's tongue so we don't have to dirty our own. I was half Oglala, half Scots-Irish, and I looked enough like either that both sides trusted me just enough to use me, and neither side trusted me enough to tell me the truth. It's a particular kind of loneliness. Being useful. I was tired. I was thinking about the 6-day ride home, and how the willow flats near my land would look by now, all going gold. I was not thinking about Harlan. I rode in for a horse reshoe and a meal. What I found was a hanging. They had her on the platform in front of the courthouse. I pulled up at the edge of the crowd. It wasn't a big crowd. Harlan was a small town, maybe 200 souls, and some of those souls had the decency to stay indoors. But there were 50 men and women in that yard, and a judge on the courthouse steps, and a deputy reading from a paper, and a woman standing on the gallows with her hands tied behind her, and a rope around her neck. She was standing straight. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the way a person stands when they're terrified and trying not to show it. Not rigid, not locked. Straight, the way a pine stands. Like the ground under her feet was solid, regardless of what was about to happen to it. She was maybe 30 years old. Dark hair. A long gray dress with mud on the hem. She was looking out over the crowd, not at the judge, not at the deputy with his paper. Out past them. The way you look when you've decided that what's in front of you isn't worth the focus of your eyes. I asked the man beside me what she'd done. He said she'd stolen cattle. I asked how many. He said 2. I sat with that a moment. 2 cattle. A rope. I asked who owned the cattle. He looked at me like I'd asked something ridiculous. Judge Carnahan, he said. The cattle belonged to Judge Carnahan. I looked at the man on the courthouse steps, large man. Red-faced in the way of men who drink early in the day. Expensive coat, dirty at the cuffs. He was watching the woman on the gallows with an expression I recognized. Not rage, not even satisfaction. Hunger. The expression of a man who wants something, and is about to get it, and doesn't care anymore, who sees that he wants it. My right hand ached. I should tell you what I knew about Judge Carnahan before that morning. I knew his name. It was one of those names that came up in the territory the way certain smells come up. You catch it, you recognize it, and you know what's nearby without having to look. He'd been appointed by a territorial governor who owed money to men who needed land cleared. He had been, by the accounts I'd heard, clearing it. A homesteader who contested a boundary and ended up in Carnahan's court lost the contest, and sometimes the land, and occasionally If Carnahan was in a particular mood, something else besides. I didn't know the woman. I learned later her name was Anna Voss, widow of a German immigrant who'd come to Montana for the same reason everyone came to Montana. The idea of land, the idea of a start, the idea that a man could put his hands into something and it would become his. Husband Carl had died of a lung sickness the previous winter, leaving her with 40 acres of bad grass, a leaking roof, 2 small children, and a debt to the Harlan Mercantile that Carnahan had bought 3 months after Carl's death. 2 cattle she'd taken were grazing on her own grass, on the 40 acres, on what had been her husband's land. Carnahan had moved the boundary markers. She'd taken the cattle back. He'd had her arrested that night. I didn't know all of this yet when I sat on my horse at the edge of that yard. I knew the judge's name. I knew the look on his face. I knew the woman was standing straight. I knew I wasn't going to watch it. There are things I've done in my life that I understood at the time. I thought them through. I weighed them. I chose. There are other things I did before the thinking started. The way you pull your hand from a fire. Not decision. Just the body knowing what the body won't accept. I got down from my horse. I walked to the front of the crowd. I walked up the steps to the gallows. The deputy stopped reading. The crowd got very quiet. The woman on the gallows turned her head and looked at me, and her eyes were the color of creek water over slate. Gray-green, cool, lit within, somehow, and not afraid. Not afraid at all. That landed on me like something physical. I felt it in my chest. I took out my knife and I cut the rope. Not the rope around her neck. That would have dropped her through the platform when the lever went. The main rope. The rope that ran from the noose, up through the crossbeam, and down to the mechanism. I cut it at the crossbeam, where I could reach it standing on the railing. The noose went slack around her neck. Everything went very quiet. Then Carnahan said, "Arrest that man." What happened in the next 4 minutes I'll tell you quickly, because the details aren't what matter. And also because some of them I'm not proud of. There were 2 deputies. One of them was between me and the woman before Carnahan finished speaking, and I put him on the ground with his own arm. The other one was smarter and hung back, and that was wise, because I was not in a mood to be careful. I cut the rope from Anna Voss's wrists. I took her hand. I said, "Walk." She walked. We went down the back of the gallows steps and across the yard and around the side of the courthouse. My horse was at the rail in front. Put her up and got up behind her, and we rode. Carnahan was screaming behind us. Could hear it fading as we put distance between ourselves and that courthouse yard. Not fear in his voice, rage. Particular rage of a man who is not accustomed to things happening that he hasn't ordered. We rode north. I knew a place. A line camp belonging to a cattle outfit I'd worked for years before, empty since summer, far enough from Harlan that it would take them most of a day to reach it if they were on foot. I didn't know yet whether the deputies had horses ready. We rode for 2 hours without speaking. The line camp was as I remembered it. 1 room, a stove, a pile of wood somebody had left under an oilcloth tarp. I built a fire, and she sat in the single chair, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and for a while, neither of us said anything. She was looking at the floor. Not with distress, looking the way a person looks when they're sorting through something, putting things in order. Finally, she said, "Why did you do that?" Not a question exactly, not an accusation. The way you say a thing when you need to hear it said out loud. I said, "Because it was wrong." She looked at me, said, "A lot of things in that town are wrong. Nobody cut the rope before." I told her I hadn't been in that town before. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you know what you've done?" I said I had a fair idea. She said, "He'll send for the marshals. He'll have a warrant by tomorrow. He'll call it assault on a deputy, interfering with a lawful execution." "Theft," I said. "Was it a lawful execution?" She stopped, looked at me again, said quieter, "No," I said. "Then we'll need to make that plain somewhere. A judge can hear it." A different judge. She looked at me for a long time after that. I couldn't read all of what was in her face. There was something complicated there. A woman putting together a situation she hadn't asked for. A stranger who'd reached into her dying and pulled her out of it. And she was trying to figure what that meant, what it cost, what it required of her. She wasn't a woman who liked owing. I understood that without her saying it. I said, "You don't owe me anything for what I did back there. I cut that rope because I chose to. Not for payment," she said. "I know why you did it," I said. "Do you?" she said. "Because you could." I thought about that for a long time. Sitting on the floor of that cold line camp while the stove ticked and the wind pressed at the one window. Because you could. It's a stranger thing to say than it sounds. Not because you had the skill, not because you had the knife, because you could, meaning because the thing in you that decides what you will and won't watch, what you will and won't allow, was bigger in that moment than the thing in you that calculates cost. I said, "Where are your children?" She closed her eyes for a moment. She said, "Mrs. Engel. 3 miles east of my land. She took them when they arrested me," I said. "Good, we'll send word in the morning." She looked at the fire for a while. Then she said, "What's your name?" I told her. She said it back, getting the Lakota part of it right on the first try, which surprised me. I said so. She said her husband had had a Lakota friend. She'd learned some words. We were quiet again after that. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in a place after something hard has happened and both people in it have decided, without saying so, that they're going to be all right. In the morning, I rode to the nearest town, with a telegraph office, which was Ridgeline, 10 miles northeast, and I sent 3 wires. One to a lawyer in Helena I knew, a man named Prentice, who had fought Carnahan's appointments before the Territorial Assembly and lost and was, I calculated, still angry about it. One to the agency at Standing Rock, where I had friends who knew men in the federal marshal's office. Men above Carnahan's reach, men appointed by a different governor. One to the editor of the Helena Weekly Independent, a woman named Grace Halford, who had, in my experience, a particular taste for stories about corrupt judges. Then I rode back to the line camp. Anna Voss had swept the floor and found a tin of coffee in the supply cache and had it ready when I came through the door. She handed me the cup before I'd taken my coat off. And the gesture was so matter-of-fact, so without ceremony, that something about it caught in me. Like she'd been doing it for years. Like the line camp was a kitchen and I was coming home. I drank the coffee and told her what I'd done. She listened without interrupting, which I already knew was her way. When I finished, she said, "Do you think Prentice will come?" "Shh," I said. "I thought he'd ride through a blizzard for the chance to put Carnahan in front of a federal judge." She almost smiled. Quite. Her face was careful about what it gave away. But there was something in the corners of it, a loosening, and I filed that away without examining why. She said, "How long?" I said, "A week, maybe. Possibly 2. She looked at the fire. She said, "My land." I said, "I know." She said, "He'll move on the land while I'm gone. Move the markers back, put his people on it." I said, "We have witnesses to the original markers. Your husband filed a survey." She looked at me, said, "You know this how?" I said, "I asked the man at the telegraph office in Ridgeline to pull the county records while I was there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've done this kind of thing before." I said I'd worked in the territory a long time. I knew how these things moved. She said, "Who are you, exactly?" Told her. More than my name this time. Who my mother was, who my father was, where I'd grown up, what I'd done, the agency work. The years before that, scouting for the Army and then leaving the Army when I understood what I was scouting for. The interpreter work, particular loneliness of the work. I don't know why I told her so much. I'm not a man who talks about himself easily, but she asked as if she actually wanted to know. Not making conversation, being polite. And there was something in the way she listened that made words come out of me that I'd been keeping for a long time. When I stopped, she said, "You've been doing the right thing in the wrong place for a long time." I said I wasn't sure I'd call it that. She said, "I would." The fire popped. The wind had dropped. Out the window, the hills were going orange gold in the early morning light. The aspens, the whole slope of them, shaking in some small breath of air. And it was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask permission. It's just there, clear and complete, and you know while it's happening that you're going to carry it. We stayed at the line camp for 11 days. I want to be careful about how I tell you this part, because it would be easy to tell it the wrong way. To make it sound romantic in some soft sense, some story of proximity and firelight, turning into something warmer. It was warmer, but that's not the whole shape of it, and the whole shape matters. We worked. She was not a woman who sat with her hands still. 3 days in, she'd found tools in the supply cache, a hammer, nails, plane, and was fixing the window frame, which had warped over the summer, and let cold air in at the corner. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done her own repairs for years, which she had. She didn't ask me to help, and she didn't tell me what she was doing. She just did it, the way she'd do anything. Directly, without announcement, all her attention on the task. I found myself watching her, the way you watch something that's good at what it does. Not with desire. Not yet. With something closer to respect. I cut more firewood than we needed. I checked the horses twice a day, more than necessary. I found things to do with my hands, because I did not quite know what to do with the rest of me. On the 4th day, she said, without looking up from the harness she was mending, "You don't have to keep inventing work." I said I wasn't inventing it. She said, "Chopped enough wood for a full winter," I said. "The winter might be long." She looked at me then, the almost smile again. And this time it went further. A real smile, brief as light off water, gone almost before I could be sure I'd seen it. She looked back at the harness. She said, "Sit down." I sat down, she said. "Tell me about your land. You said you had land." So I told her, the Willow Flats. The creek that ran through the north end of my property. Cold even in August, fed by a spring I'd never found the source of. The small herd I ran, not for profit mostly, just for the work of it, the satisfaction of land being used. The house I'd built myself, room by room, over 6 years, which meant it was slightly uneven, and the windows weren't all plumb, but it was mine from the foundation up. And I knew every board in. She listened, she said. No family, I said. Not for a long time, she said. What happened, I said. Different things at different times. She nodded. She didn't push. She understood the shape of that answer. That there had been people and they were gone. And the goneness of them was not a simple story but a set of smaller losses, accumulated over years, until the man who was left was a man who worked alone and knew his horses better than he knew any person living, she said. The children. You want to know about them. I said, I didn't need to know anything she didn't want to tell. She said, I want you to know. Carrying things for me. You should know what you're carrying. So she told me. Carl. The sickness that came on him slowly. The months of watching it come. The way he'd kept working until he couldn't. The way he'd apologized for dying. As if it were a failure of character. Children. A girl of 7, a boy of 5. The winter after Carl, the worst winter of her life. The debts and the cold and the way the town had looked at her. Not with cruelty exactly, just with the particular indifference of people who have their own problems and don't have enough sympathy left over to cover yours. The sense of being seen, of being invisible the way the poor and the widowed are, invisible, present but not counted, she said. Carnahan started with the land 6 months ago. First it was just the debt. He owned the note. Then the fences, then the markers. I knew what he was doing. I went to the sheriff twice. The sheriff told me to be careful making accusations. I said, "Did you know he'd have you arrested?" She said, "I thought he might." I went anyway. I looked at her. She said, "They were on my land. My husband's cattle on my husband's land, with my husband's brand on them. And I was supposed to leave them there because a man in a black coat moved a marker in the dark." I couldn't do it, I said. "No," she said. "I thought they'd fine me. Jail for a few days, I didn't think." She stopped. I said, "I know." She looked at the fire. she said very quietly, when I was standing there, on that platform. I wasn't scared, isn't that strange? I was angry. I kept thinking my children are going to grow up and be told their mother stole cattle. That's what Carnahan would have put in the record. A thief. That's what they'd have known of me. Something happened in my chest when she said that. A pressure. Not painful, the opposite, if that makes sense. Like something had been clenched for a long time and was deciding whether to let go. I said, "That's not what the record will say when we're done." She looked at me. I said, "I promise you that." She looked at me for a long moment. The fire had burned low, and I could just see her face in the dim orange light. The set of her jaw, the line of her brow, the gray-green eyes that didn't soften into sentimentality, but held something else. Something I had to search for a word for. I settled on trust. It was given carefully, the way she gave everything. Not easily, not naively. With full knowledge of what it cost and what it meant. I didn't want to waste it. Prentice arrived on the 9th day with a federal warrant and 2 deputy marshals and a document from Helena that made very interesting reading. 3 sworn affidavits from former Harlan residents, 2 of whom had left after losing property in Carnahan's court, and 1 of whom had lost considerably more than property. He was a small man, Prentice. Quick-eyed. Shh. He shook my hand and looked at Anna Voss, and said he'd heard about her case in 3 days before my wire arrived, from a homesteader who'd passed through Helena and told anyone who'd listen. He said, "You chose a good moment to cut that rope." I said I hadn't been aware of the timing. He said, "There were 6 people in that crowd who'd been waiting for someone to do something for 2 years. 3 of them are willing to testify. 1 of them has documents." Anna said, "What kind of documents?" Prentice looked at her. He said, "The kind that show where Judge Carnahan's money comes from and where it goes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is it enough?" He said, "It's more than enough. What I need from you is a statement, what the land was, what your husband filed, what Carnahan did, and when. Can you do that?" She said she could do that. He said, "Good. Then we're going to Helena." The ride to Helena took 4 days. Prentice talked constantly. Legal strategy, territorial politics, the particular texture of Carnahan's corruption, and how to present it to a federal judge who'd been trying to find a lever against the man for 18 months. I understood about half of the legal detail and all of the human detail. Men had been protected by his appointment, by the men who'd made it, by the particular machinery of territorial governance that let a man with a judge's title do things in rural counties that would have had him arrested in the city. What Prentice had was a crack in that machinery. Anna's case was clean, documented, simple. 2 cattle, a survey, a murdered woman, almost, in front of witnesses. Anna rode beside me most of the way. Shh. We didn't talk much during the riding. Prentice filled the silence well enough. But in the evenings, when we camped, after Prentice and the marshals had settled down, we sat by the fire and talked. She told me about Germany, about the village her husband had come from, in a valley near a river, with old stone buildings, and a church her grandmother had been baptized in, about why Carl had left. The land there was old and divided, and the opportunity was shrinking, and he'd had a cousin who'd come to Montana and written back about the space of it, the vastness, the feeling of room, about arriving in New York Harbor and seeing the skyline, and Carl gripping her hand and saying something in German that she'd translated for me. Enough room to breathe. I said, "Did you find that?" She said, "For a while." She looked at the fire. She said, "He would have hated what Carnahan did to his land." Carl was a careful man. Not aggressive, not proud in a bad way, but careful. Things should be as they are. A man's survey should stand. He filed that survey the week we arrived. He walked the boundary himself with the surveyor, 4 hours in the cold, to make sure every mark was right. I said, "It stood. We'll make it stand again." She looked at me sideways, said, "You say that like it's simple." I said, "It is, once you're in the right court." She said, "How are you so certain?" I said, "Because what he did was simple." He moved markers in the dark. Everything else he built on top of that is complicated. But the foundation is simple, and it's wrong. And a federal judge with the right documents will see it. She was quiet. Then she said, "I want to believe you," I said. "Then, believe me." She looked at me. That look I was learning, the weighing of it, the careful appraisal. She didn't give belief easily or cheaply. But she didn't withhold it without reason either. She said, "All right." Then she said, quieter, like she was saying it to herself as much as to me, "All right, Helena, in October. Cold light off the mountains. The streets busy with the particular energy of a territorial capital that knows it's going to be a state capital soon and is already behaving accordingly." We went to Prentice's office first. He had a clerk who took Anna's statement for 3 hours, while Prentice and I drank bad coffee in an anteroom and talked about nothing in particular. His children, my cattle, the weather coming down from the north. At one point he said, "You understand this is going to follow you," I said. "What will?" he said. "The rope. What you did in Harlan. Carnahan still has friends. He's gonna make it expensive for you before this is done." I said I'd been expensive before. He looked at me, said, "You've got property, land," he said. "So does she," he said. "That's what I mean." I understood what he meant. I understood it fully. He meant that the safest thing for me, that point, would have been to give my statement, let the legal process run, earn to my land and my horses and my quiet life, and let Anna Voss and her case be what they would be, without my further involvement. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Is there anything else you need me for?" He said, "The hearing's in 4 days. Having you there would help, or material witness." I said, "I'll be there," he said. "And after," I said, "I'll figure that out after." He nodded. Shh. He was a man who understood that some decisions can't be made before the moment that requires them. He didn't push. Those 4 days in Helena, I spent at a hotel 2 streets from Prentice's office, and Anna spent them there too. Different rooms, floors. The proprietress, a formidable woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had very clear views about the appropriate arrangement of unmarried, since under her roof, and who I respected entirely. But we ate dinner together each evening in the hotel dining room, and on the second evening her children arrived. Her neighbor, Mrs. Engel, had brought them up by stage when the wire came, and I met them for the first time. The girl was named Liesel, 7 years old, serious-faced, her mother's gray-green eyes, a braid that she kept touching, as if to reassure herself it was there. The boy was named Franz, 5, a round-faced, solemn child who stared at me from behind his mother's arm for the first 10 minutes. And then, with no announcement, walked over and put his hand on my knee and looked up at me and said, "Are you the one who cut the rope?" I said I was. He thought about this. Then, he sat down next to me, still solemn, and picked up my hand and examined it. The way a boy examines a tool he's been told is important. He turned it over, looked at the palm, looked at the calluses, looked at the scar on the back from the bullet years ago. He set my hand back down with great care. He looked up at me and said, "Mama said you were big." Anna, across the table, was looking at her plate. Corners of her mouth had given her away. Liesel, from her chair, said, "Are you going to come back with us?" The table went quiet. I looked at Anna. She was looking at me now, not away, watching, not directing. Whatever I said was mine to say. She wasn't going to manage it or steer it. She was going to let it be what it was. I said, "I haven't decided yet." Liesel thought about this. She said, "We have a horse. He's old. Papa's horse. He's very slow," I said. "I have horses, younger ones." Liesel considered this with the gravity of a diplomat. She said, "That could be useful." Franz, beside me, put his small hand back over mine and left it there and said nothing, and went back to eating his supper. The hearing was on a Thursday. I'll tell you what happened plainly, because the beauty of it is in the plainness. Federal Judge Archibald Morse, a spare man from Ohio, appointed under a different administration, no connection to Carnahan, and no patience for men who bought judicial appointments, heard the case in 2 days. Prentice put the survey in front of him. He put the affidavits in front of him. He put the financial records in front of him. He put Anna Voss in front of him. And she sat straight in the witness chair the way she'd stood straight on the gallows, and she answered every question in a clear voice and did not waver. I testified on the second morning. An hour, maybe a little more. I described what I'd seen and what I'd done and why, and I said it plainly. And when Carnahan's lawyer tried to characterize the cutting of the rope as an assault on the court, I said, the court was killing a woman for taking back her own cattle from a man who'd moved her husband's survey markers in the dark. What I cut was the rope, not the law. Morse looked at me for a long moment after that. Then he looked at his papers. He ruled that afternoon. Carnahan's judgment against Anna Voss's property was voided. Her husband's survey was reinstated. The land was hers, clear. Carnahan himself was referred to the territorial governor for removal from the bench, and the federal prosecutor was given the financial documents to examine for criminal charges. He was removed. The charges came. I won't tell you what became of them. That's a longer story, and mostly happened in rooms I wasn't in. But I'll tell you this. Carnahan never sat on a bench again, and the land stayed Anna's. After the ruling, on the courthouse steps, in the cold October air, with the mountains white behind the city, and the smell of wood smoke coming off every chimney in Helena, Anna Voss turned to me and put her forehead against my chest. Not throwing herself at me, not collapsing, she stood the way she always stood, straight, grounded on her own weight. But she leaned that small distance forward and put her forehead against my chest and stayed there for a moment. Her hands came up and held my coat, just holding, the way you hold something to confirm it's real. I put my arms around her. She said, muffled against my coat. Thank you, I said. You did the hard part, she said. You cut the rope, I said. Anyone would have. She pulled back and looked at me. Eyes were wet, not crying, but close the way they get when something that's been held a long time finally sets down its weight. She said, no, not anyone. I stood on that platform for 20 minutes before you came. Not anyone. I looked at her face. The careful face, the face that didn't give things away easily. And right now it was giving something away. Not vulnerability exactly. Something more particular than that. A kind of offering. Here is what I see, it said. Here is what I think is true. Prentice came through the courthouse door behind us and said something cheerful about the ruling. And the November stage north. Liesel and Franz were with Mrs. Engel somewhere down the steps. The city moved around us. She stepped back, straightened her coat, looked at me. She said, I meant what I asked at dinner the other night. I want you to understand I meant it. She hadn't asked at dinner. She hadn't said anything at dinner about it. That was the thing. She'd watched me with the children, and she'd watched me look at the mountains, and she'd watched me describe my land, and she'd said nothing. But something had been decided in her over those 4 days. She was telling me it had been decided, and she was letting me know that if there was a corresponding decision in me, it would be received. Said, I know you meant it. She nodded. She said, well, I said, well. She looked at the street. Said, it's a 2-day ride back to my land, I said. 4, probably. With the children, she said. They ride well, I said. I know they do. She looked at me sidelong, and the real smile came. Not brief this time, not gone before I could catch it, but present, warm, there. Her face in full, unguarded. It was something. She said, I suppose you'd better come then. The rope on my post. I cut it down from the gallows crossbeam before we left Harlan, rode back through on the way south, and the gallows was still standing, a hand gone, and the town stunned and quiet, and I climbed up and cut the rope from the beam and coiled it and put it in my saddlebag. Anna asked me, that night on the road, why I'd taken it. I thought about it, I said, so I'd remember what it cost to do nothing. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, it didn't cost you anything to do something. I said, I mean the other thing. The people who stood there for 20 minutes. People who'd stood there for 2 years watching Carnahan do what he did. I want to remember what that kind of quiet costs. She looked at me, the gray-green eyes in the firelight. She said, You think you might have been one of them, I said. I don't know. I hope not. I want to remember that I might have been, she said. You weren't, I said this time. She was quiet. Then she said, yes, this time. We rode onto my land 4 days later. In the late afternoon, with the willows all gone gold, and the creek catching the light through them, and the mountains beyond white and sharp against a sky so blue it hurt. Liesel stood up in the stirrups. Franz fell asleep against my arm for the last miles, and I rode with him there, one arm around him, and I thought about Karl Voss, who had walked a survey boundary in the cold to make sure every mark was right, who had stood in New York Harbor and held his wife's hand and said enough room to breathe, and I thought, I'll take care of it, Karl. The marks will stand. The house wasn't plumb, and the windows weren't level, and there was work to do on the east pasture fence that I'd been putting all summer. Anna walked through every room while the children ran through the grass. And she touched the walls. The way you touch things you're going to make decisions about. And when she came back out, she looked at the slope of the land, and the willows, and the mountains, and she said, it's not level, I said. No, she said, we should fix that east wall before winter. I said, I know, she said. I can do the framing if you do the stone, I said. I know you can. She looked at me, the almost smile, and then the real one. I reached out and took her hand. She let me. We stood there in the afternoon light, the two of us, with her children running in the grass, and the willows going gold, and the creek cold below us, and neither of us said anything, and neither of us needed to. That rope has hung on that post for 31 years. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of Carnahan, who doesn't deserve to be remembered. As what I told her it was, a memory of the cost of standing still when a thing is wrong, and a memory of the morning I didn't. Your grandmother is in the kitchen right now. You can hear her. She's been up since before the light. The way she always is. Because she says the early morning is the only time the house belongs entirely to itself, before all the people in it claim it. Back. She'll have coffee ready in an hour. She'll send you off tomorrow, with enough food for 3 days, and a list of the people on the route who can be trusted. 'Cause she'll have written them already, and she'll make you read the list twice. She does this because she is good at taking care. She was good at it before I knew her, and she's been good at it every day since. And I want you to understand what kind of thing that is. Not a small thing, not a domestic thing, not a thing that happens by accident. A choice, made every morning. A woman who could have become bitter, and she had reason, God knows she had reason, and chose not to. She chose me, which I will never fully understand, and have spent 31 years trying to be worthy of. You're going into army work now. You're young, and you're good, and you'll be, and being useful will feel like enough for a while. But I want you to carry this with you, not as advice. I know you don't want advice. You're 20 years old, and advice is something that happens to other people. But as a fact about how things work. Doing the right thing is not always the clean thing. Sometimes it's the thing that costs you something, the thing that puts you sideways with the people who run things, the thing that ties situations you didn't choose and a life you hadn't planned. That morning in Harlan cost me 3 months of legal trouble and a warrant that wasn't dropped until January, and the enmity of men who stayed powerful in the territory for years after Carnahan fell. I would do it again before I finish thinking about it. Not because I'm brave. I'm not particularly. Not because I'm good. I'm not always that either. Because the woman standing on that gallows was straight. Because she was looking past the crowd at something I couldn't see. Because my hand ached and I already knew what it knew. The rope is there. Coffee will be ready in an hour. Go sleep a little more. End of story 87.